Power. Everyone wants it, but few truly understand how it's acquired. We like to believe leaders rise through merit, vision, or the will of the people, but the truth, as always, is much less romantic. In this episode of the Powerbook of Podcasts, we delve into Chapter 2 of the Dictator's Handbook to answer a crucial question. How does someone actually gain power? Spoiler. It's not about charisma, it's about strategy. Every leader, before they are a leader, must play a game of numbers, not votes, not applause, not popularity, support, strategic support. According to De Mesquita and Smith, the authors of the Dictator's Handbook, the path to power depends on one simple variable: how many people you need to keep on your side. If you only need 10 loyal allies, your strategy is vastly different from someone who needs 10 million voters. The fewer people you need to please, the more power you can accumulate with fewer compromises. That's why some of the world's most powerful leaders never had to win a real election. They only needed to win over a few generals, a few judges, a few party insiders. Power, in its rawest form, is arithmetic. Let's look at 3 historical examples to see how the numbers shape the road to power. First, take Mao Zedong. At the beginning of his rise, he didn't need mass support. He needed the loyalty of his guerrilla fighters and the ability to maneuver within the fractured Chinese Communist Party. He focused on those few leaders and cadres who controlled resources, strategy, and ideology. The millions of peasants came later, when he had already secured the apparatus of violence and organization. Contrast this with someone like Barack Obama. His rise to power required rallying millions of people. He had to win primaries in a competitive party system, mobilize volunteers across all 50 states, and engage a massive donor base. That required a broad, sustained campaign of persuasion, messaging, and coalition building. The difference in scale changes the kind of skills and compromises required. Then there's Napoleon Bonaparte. His path was similar to Mao, in that he initially needed a narrow base, the military. He gained notoriety as a general, then used his popularity among officers and soldiers to secure a coup in 1799. From there, he methodically consolidated power. He didn't need to be universally loved, just respected, feared, and trusted by enough key players to take control. These examples show that gaining power doesn't always start with the people. Often it begins with the few who matter most. Now here's the twist. The size of the group you need to win over is not always fixed. It's determined by the rules of the game. In a democracy with fair elections, that number is large. In an autocracy, it's small. And smart aspirants tailor their strategies accordingly. If you live in a parliamentary system, you might focus on winning the support of party leadership, not the public at large. If you're in a dictatorship, the key could be the head of the secret police. And in a corporation, it might be just 5 board members. Understanding who the essentials are in any given system is the first step to gaining power. This is the numbers game. Play it well, and you're on your way to becoming a ruler. Play it poorly, and you're out before you begin. To acquire power, you must master 3 things. Identify the essential group. Convince them to support you. Keep your promises, at least to them. This might sound simple, but in practice it involves navigating complex networks of loyalty, expectation, and leverage. Let's expand on this by revisiting and deepening our earlier examples, and adding more. In post-Soviet Russia, Vladimir Putin didn't rise by popular movement. He was handpicked by Boris Yeltsin's inner circle, the so-called Siloviki, former intelligence officers, oligarchs, and military insiders, who had strong influence over the state machinery. These actors were anxious. Yeltsin's health was failing. The country was in chaos. They needed a successor who would stabilize the system without threatening their privileges. Putin appeared unthreatening, disciplined, and competent. But once in, he wasted no time. He rewarded his supporters with greater access to natural resources, state contracts, and protection from prosecution. Simultaneously, he moved to eliminate any rival factions, most notably by arresting Mikhail Khodorkovsky and exiling other oligarchs who challenged his control. Putin didn't need the love of the people to rise. He needed the confidence of a few powerful actors, and he delivered. Now consider the case of Margaret Thatcher. Her rise was more democratic, but no less strategic. In the British parliamentary system, a prime minister is not elected by the public at large, but by their own party. To gain power, Thatcher had to win over the Conservative Party leadership, challenge the existing consensus, and build a coalition within a male-dominated hierarchy. She identified key MPs who could be persuaded, lobbied behind the scenes, and eventually toppled her predecessor. She didn't seek mass support until she had consolidated elite backing. Let's take a radically different example: Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. In 1969, as a young army officer, Gaddafi led a bloodless coup against King Idris. How? By securing the loyalty of just a handful of fellow officers and taking over key military installations. He didn't have a political party, he didn't have popular support, but he had the essentials: men with guns in strategic places. Once in power, he created a bizarre mix of ideology and patronage, sustaining his rule for over 4 decades. And in the business world, consider Steve Jobs. When he returned to Apple in 1997, he didn't come back as a charismatic outsider. He returned with leverage. He had built Pixar. He had powerful allies in Silicon Valley. And he convinced Apple's board, his essential group, that he was the only one who could turn the company around. Jobs' power didn't rest on public opinion. It rested on a boardroom decision. These cases illustrate the second rule of acquisition. You must convince your essentials that their future is better with you than without you. Sometimes that means promising wealth. Sometimes that means offering protection. Sometimes that means enabling them to fulfill their own ambitions. Whatever the formula, it's not ideology that binds power coalitions. It's self-interest. And that leads to the third rule. Once you have their support, you must deliver. The loyalty of your essential group is not unconditional. It must be maintained with favors, positions, influence, or at the very least, not threatening their standing. That's why so many new leaders spend their first months in office rewarding allies and punishing enemies. That's why corruption is often highest not under the worst leaders, but under the most strategic ones. Let's add one final example: Franklin D. Roosevelt. Though widely admired today, FDR's rise to power was deeply strategic. He navigated the complex network of Democratic Party bosses, Southern segregationists, and labor leaders to build the New Deal coalition. He knew that he needed broad support, so he offered different things to different people: jobs, public works, protections, patronage. His brilliance wasn't just in vision, it was in coalition building. In sum, acquiring power isn't a mystery, it's a method. Identify who matters most. Make them believe in your leadership. Keep them loyal by giving them what they need. This is the logic of the dictator, the Democrat, the CEO, and the activist alike. Power doesn't come from popularity. It comes from control over the few who matter most. And those few, they're always watching, waiting to see if you're still their best option. Another lesson from the Handbook. To win power, you often need to take it from someone else. This doesn't always mean violence, but it does mean outmaneuvering the current leader's coalition. Sometimes this involves promising better rewards to key supporters. Sometimes it means exploiting dissatisfaction. Sometimes it's pure betrayal. Remember Julius Caesar? He wasn't just a brilliant general, he was a master coalition builder and destroyer. He offered the Roman public and the military better terms than the Senate. That's how he crossed the Rubicon. Caesar made sure that those who mattered most, the legions and certain magistrates, stood to gain more with him than under the status quo. His assassination years later was not a result of poor planning, but of the resentment from those he had displaced in his power grab. In modern terms, think of Hugo Chavez. He didn't start as a dictator, he was elected, but he gained power by dividing the political elite and offering the military more power and resources than any previous leader. He used oil wealth to fund loyalty and punish those who questioned him. He also portrayed himself as a reformer, which helped him draw soft support from marginalized sectors, all while he consolidated hard power where it counted. Or take the example of Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey. Before consolidating power as a strongman, Erdogan worked within the democratic system. He gained trust by presenting himself as a moderate Islamist and modernizer. But behind the scenes, he methodically weakened rival power centers, the judiciary, the military, and secular elites. He did this not by confrontation at first, but by persuasion, co-optation, and slow erosion. His success came from offering just enough rewards to keep key figures loyal while framing his actions as democratic reform. In South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa's quiet ascension within the African National Congress came not by force, but through tactical alliances and silent positioning. He waited for Jacob Zuma's growing scandals to weaken his base, then capitalized by presenting himself as the cleaner, more stable option. His strategy wasn't to destroy Zuma openly, but to win over the ANC elite behind closed doors. In companies, this same principle holds. A rising executive doesn't get the CEO's job by being the most popular employee. They usually gain it by persuading a board that they can manage stakeholders, increase profits, or control risk better than the current leader. This often involves undermining competitors internally, not with open conflict, but by showing key decision-makers that you are a more reliable bet. One of the most infamous historical examples comes from the court of Henry VIII. Thomas Cromwell rose not by birth or wealth, but by being indispensable. He undercut rivals at court, controlled access to the king, and managed to tie his own survival to the success of the crown's new policies. When he fell, it wasn't because he lost popular support. It was because his replacements convinced the king that Cromwell had become a liability. To win power, you don't need everyone. You just need the right ones to switch sides. And often the best way to do that is not through confrontation, but through calculated persuasion, well-timed favors, and subtle sabotage. Undermining rivals is not an accident, it's a craft. And the most successful practitioners are those who can build while they dismantle. Institutions are supposed to stop power grabs, but institutions are made of people, and people have incentives. A weak judiciary won't stand up to a rising leader if it expects punishment or exclusion. A divided parliament won't defend democracy if a new leader promises them more influence. This is why smart power seekers spend time weakening independent institutions before their grab is complete. And it's why so many coups and authoritarian transitions happen legally. Erdogan in Turkey rewrote laws. Orban in Hungary changed the constitution. They didn't break the system. They rewired it. But how do institutions become vulnerable in the first place? Often it's through gradual decay, not sudden collapse. In the Philippines, Ferdinand Marcos initially used the institutions of democracy to gain legitimacy. He declared martial law in 1972, citing threats to national security. But this legal mechanism allowed him to dismantle checks and balances under the guise of protecting the nation. The courts became tools of repression. Congress was sidelined, and all of it happened while maintaining the appearance of constitutional order. In Venezuela, Hugo Chavez used a series of referenda and legislative changes to reshape institutions in his favor. He expanded the size of the Supreme Court and filled it with loyalists. He changed the rules of the National Assembly. Over time, institutions that were meant to balance power became instruments of power consolidation. And it's not just autocracies. In the United States, political scientists have warned about constitutional hardball, tactics that are technically legal but violate the spirit of democratic norms. Gerrymandering, court-packing threats, legislative obstruction. These moves erode trust in institutions and make it easier for future leaders to justify more extreme steps. The lesson is this: institutions don't protect themselves. They rely on leaders and citizens to respect norms and enforce accountability. But when power is the goal, respecting norms becomes optional and even dangerous for the ambitious. Those who seek power often see institutions not as barriers, but as tools. They either capture them from within or circumvent them entirely. Think of Xi Jinping's rise in China. He used anti-corruption campaigns to remove rivals, centralize authority, and abolish term limits. The Chinese Communist Party, itself an institution, was re-engineered to reflect his supremacy. The result was not a rejection of institutions, but their full subordination to one man's control. That's the paradox. The most effective autocrats don't destroy institutions, they master them. And for anyone who hopes to defend democracy, the takeaway is sobering. Formal rules are not enough. Institutional resilience requires transparency, civic engagement, and a culture of accountability, or else it becomes just another ladder for the ambitious to climb. You don't gain power by inspiring people. You gain power by convincing the right people that you will serve their interests better than the current ruler. The rest is packaging. In our next episode, we'll talk about how power is kept and why so many revolutions turn into new dictatorships. For now, ask yourself, if you had to gain power tomorrow, who would you really need on your side? If you found this episode insightful, subscribe, share, and leave your reflections in the comments. This is the Powerbook of Podcasts. Until next time.